Hey there everyone, it's Preston from DevRocket. Today we're going to be building a simple Express server using TypeScript. Let's dive right in. All right, so the first thing that we want to do is check that TypeScript is installed. And we do in fact have it installed. If you don't have it installed, you're just going to want to run npm i-g for global TypeScript. So you can run it, run some commands on your machine, like tsc. The next thing we want to do is grab this repository, and I will have the solution code for all of this in the video, but you can also grab the repository link to clone this. So git clone, and we're going to clone it into pantry.pal. I'm going to open this up in VS Code. Once we have this open, then we're going to run we're going to install a few packages. So first of all, we want to install a bunch of packages. So TypeScript first, TS Node, which is going to help us compile and run. And this is the types for Node. So this is the basic types basically from Node. Then we want to run tsc init, which is going to create this file, this tsconfig file. And we see it right here. And first of all, when it comes up, when it first gets created, it does not look very pretty because it has a ton of comments. So I'm just going to clean all that up. I cleaned it all up here, and I have it right here in our tsconfig file. Great. Then the next thing that we want to do is create our app. So touch app.ts. It's going to create that file. And it's just a blank TS file. And we want to add a start script to run this file. So get rid of this test, and we're just going to run the start script. And so then when we go to the terminal, and we can say npm start, which is going to do nothing because that script is empty. But at least we see that it finds it, it runs it, it doesn't error, anything like that. Next thing we want to do is write our server code, and in order to do that, we need to install a few packages. So we want to install Express, and then we need to import that in our file. So this is just your basic Express server. So we want to say import Express from Express, and we're going to create our app, which is the next thing. But before we do that, we want to see this error. And what we see is Express is declared, but its value is never read. This is a very common thing to see in linters, but just noting that our linter is set up already via TypeScript, because TypeScript is watching our code, doesn't like us to define things that we aren't going to be using. Okay, cool. So then we want to create our app. And then we'll probably take a look here and see that we don't have a module or a declaration. And so what we need to do is we need to install our types. So let's say npm install types express, which is going to add this to our package JSON right here. So types express is our types that we add in. And actually, this should go into our dev dependencies. So that we don't need the types when we are running our application. We just need it when we're building it, right? And when we're developing. Great. And so then this gets rid of that error. Awesome. So now we can go ahead and make our app. We can get our port from our environment variable, and then we can listen on the port, and then we can say, great, our server has started up. Perfect. And then TypeScript doesn't like the fact that we did not finish up that. Well, that's actually going to cause an error when we run the application. Great. So then now we know that we can actually start our application. We could say TS node app.js, and we see, great, it's listening on port 3000. So there aren't any routes yet. So let's create a route. Let's create a get recipes, because this is a pantry pal. And so then we're going to app.get recipes. And if you've done Express before, you know what this is all about. This is the route This is the request object and the response. And we can send back something like hello world or recipes to come, which is what I'm going to choose because recipes to come, because this is a recipe application, right? So then we can restart our application. But if you notice, restarting this is a little bit frustrating, right? We don't want to have to restart our server every single time that we write code. If you've written JavaScript servers before, Express servers, you know that there's this great thing called NodeMon, and we can use that actually with TypeScript. So we can tell TypeScript to watch or tell NodeMon to watch our TypeScript files and everything that it is compiling and recompile on the fly, which is great. So let's do a few things. We're going to add a new directory, and we will move our app into that new directory. And that's what we're going to do right here. And the reason why we are doing this is because the next step that we're doing is we need to change our start script to run our app and watch all of our code. Now, I'm pasting all this in because it could take forever to do all this in the video. Feel free to look into all of this and the details of what it's doing. But basically what we're saying is NodeMon, hey, watch these files in the source directory. That's why we moved everything to the source directory. We don't want to watch our package lock. We don't want to watch our tsconfig or anything like that. Watch the source directory. And for anything that has the extension of TS or JSON, because we moved that recipes.json, and we want to ignore any of our test files, which we don't have any, but if we had some, then we want to ignore them. And then we want to execute that TS node source app TS, which is saying we want to run that server as we are developing. Great. So now when we save all of this, we should be able to run our start. And then now we see that it is starting that application and it's listening. And anytime we make an edit, we save, then it restarts and recompiles and restarts our server, which is amazing. This is great. So now we want to write a few routes. So let's say we want to get those recipes. Okay, so we could say res.send, and then we could pull the recipes from our recipes.json. So let's do that. Import recipes from recipes.json. But the thing is, it's not going to be able to, oh, no, not, let's see, src recipes. And now it should say, cannot find that module or its corresponding type declarations. The reason why is because we have not added in our tsconfig that we want it to watch our JSON or resolve JSON modules as well. So we're going to do that by adding this flag, resolve JSON module true, which is saying, hey, we want you to find these JSON modules and resolve them in TypeScript. Great. So now once we save that, the compiler should become very happy again. So the reason why we couldn't find the recipes file before was because we weren't actually pointing to the correct location. So, but but let's just go back to getting rid of this. When we get rid of that, our app TS is no longer happy. So great. So this is just proving that that JSON module needs to be in there in that TS config. Great. Perfect. So now we have our server up and running again. Now we need to add a DB module. So let's say touch, I'm going to move this, touch. We're going to add let's just do this in here. So we're going to touch the source db.ts, which is going to be our new database file. Now, it's not going to be a real database. We're just going to kind of mock a database. And one of the things that we are going to do first is we're going to import recipes from recipes.json. Great, found it. And then we're going to create a get module, or a get method. And we don't care about the ID because it's not get by ID or anything like that. And we're just going to return all of the recipes. Great, and TypeScript is fine with this. We haven't really defined any types yet because Some of the times we don't actually need to define the types. The types can be inferred when these things are being defined or declared in our JavaScript. But when we go back and we add export const get by index, because we want to use the index of the recipes array. So this is going to be an array of recipes instead of an ID, because it's not a real database, right? So when we create that get by index function, notice that it's actually prompting us what we want to use. But if we didn't create, or if we didn't use something like GitHub Copilot that's giving us all the answers, when we pass in that index, and this would be valid JavaScript, right? And this would work, but TypeScript is saying, hey, you haven't defined a type here yet, because we actually need to say number, because this is going to be an ID, right? Or not an ID, but an index that we're going to use to access that recipe from the recipes array. Great, so now we have exported these two. We can use this in our function, and we can say get recipes, and we will say import our database. Great. And let's say database dot get recipes. Oh, just get. Perfect. And now we are going to add a new route where we are getting by ID. So and it's not getting by ID, but it's actually getting it by index, right? And again, if you've used Express before, you know that this is a query param that we can, or not a query param, but a param that we can use that comes in on the request object as this rec.params, right? So we now have this index that comes in as this rec.params.idx. Perfect. And now we can send back that recipe. db get by index, and then if we have a recipe, or we can just send back that recipe. And we finished our route. But if you notice, this is actually telling us this is a problem. Hey, you're passing in a string, but we're expecting a number in this get by index function, which is great. TypeScript is actually catching this for us. This is a common problem in Express and sometimes servers, is where we pull in a param from a URL, a route, and that index is actually a string because it's a param, it's text that's coming in. And so we actually have to coerce that into a number. And so one of the things that we can do is we can say number and then pass that in that way. So we're coercing or casting this rec params.idx to become a number. And so then idx is going to be passed into our function. Property get by index does not exist. Oh, right. I haven't saved my file. Great. Let's take a look here. Perfect. So we've now created this get / recipes / index, right? Now for our final route, which is adding a post recipes route. App.post. Oh, let's actually say post recipes, and we're going to app.post recipes. Great. This is our route that we want. And in order to do this, before we actually go too much further, let's finish this route. Before we go too much further, we want to create an add. And we want to add a recipe. And basically, we're just pushing it into the array because we don't have like a real database set up, right? But as you notice, this recipe is saying, hey, it implicitly has this any type because we haven't defined the type. So we now want to say recipe is going to be our new recipe type. So this recipe type we can define anywhere. But since we just have this one database file, we're going to create the recipe type right here. And we can create it as a type recipe, but I'm going to use it an interface because it will actually in some cases throw us better errors and basically is just defining the shape of the data. We don't need to use a type alias. So we'll say interface recipe, and we want it to have, yes, we want it to have a string. We want it to have a description, and we want it to have an ingredients. And notice that GitHub Copilot is actually prompting me very, very helpfully that it's saying string with this square bracket. What does that mean? Well, that means that we're just going to define ingredients as a property on the recipe interface that is an array of strings. So we have string, and then we're going to finish up this recipe interface. Oops, I forgot to get rid of that. So now we have this recipe interface, which serves as a type, but oops, we need to use it. And oops, no, we have actually, we have pulled that recipe in from our parameter. And now what is this telling us? Recipe is not assignable to parameter of type. Great. Actually, all right. And so what we have discovered is that we need to define a new interface. So let's create export interface, an ingredient. It's going to have a name and a quantity. Let's take a look at some of the, name and quantity. Both of these have, so this quantity is actually a string. So let's just say string. Great. And now when we define that interface ingredient, we're going to pass that right here. So what we're saying is we now have an ingredient or an array of ingredients that is on the ingredients property of the recipe. Great. As we have seen, TypeScript can actually help us quite a bit in making sure that the shape of our data is correct. And so now that we've created our method on the DB module, we can then add our recipes right into our app. So we say const recipe equals the rec.body, which is the body of the request that's coming in, assuming somebody is posting that in with this route. So we're going to say db.add recipe. And instead of just saying recipe added, we're going to say, we're going to send in that recipe, send back that recipe with the response. Great. One last thing here is that we can also, in our DB module, TypeScript isn't telling us that we need to, but we can also define the return types of these functions. And so this get, we would want to say it's going to return a recipe type or the array of recipe types. And so in order to do that, notice that we were saying colon after this parameter right here, or the parameter block basically. And it's going to be an array of recipes is what's returning from this function. And so then we can do the same thing with the get by index. And this one is just going to be returning one recipe. And so we say get by index. Now, if we say ingredient here, then this is saying, hey, we're not returning the right type. You're returning a type that doesn't make any sense to me. So this is one of the great benefits of TypeScript, is that we can tell it what we're expecting for certain functions, what we're expecting to receive, what we're expecting to return. And we have lots of benefits in that way. In this one, we're just going to say void because we're not actually returning anything. Notice that we're just pushing something in. That might not be best practice. Maybe we want the add to return something, in which case we could add something in there. And like we could say recipe right there, and this is not happy because we're actually not returning anything. Great, so we'll just return the recipe that was passed in. And now it's happy again because we've actually returned the recipe itself. Great. So through this, I hope that you all have learned quite a bit from our TypeScript tutorial. Just there wasn't too much that was going on with types, but it's always best to start from the beginning. And we learned how to create an Express server, a real world project where we're using TypeScript to create a brand new server. Hi there, it's Preston again. If you liked today's video, I want to give you my exclusive free guide, TypeScript Essentials, 5 critical keys to using TypeScript effectively. Click the link in the description below to get access now. Thanks for watching.